Hello there, welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at Dr. Carol Marcus, the director of the Genesis project. Quite often scientists are somewhat detached from their work. They create something with all the best intentions, but actually sometimes create possibly one of the most catastrophic and destructive forces ever conceived of, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. There are those that believe that if you can design it, you can develop it, you should. And there are those that believe that we should proceed with caution and not make things that could lead to far more destructive or dangerous things further down the line, or could be abused or twisted into something that they were never meant to be. Carol Marcus was a very moral and level-headed scientist. Though not part of Starfleet, certainly a Federation scientist, she was the head of research at the Regular One station in the late 23rd century. As I said, she was developing the Genesis project. Now, this was a humanitarian project with all the good intentions of being able to turn a lifeless, dead, potentialless rock orbiting some barren star at some backwards part of the galaxy, but turn it into a beacon of life. Create a matrix and an environment that is sustainable, at least on some level, to life. This means a world, theoretically, that has the potential to have had life, but doesn't have it for whatever reason. A planet, say, like Venus or Mars, that theoretically could have become like Earth, but didn't. Now, these changes could be permanent, they could be short-term, as in short-term on a galactic stage of a few million, maybe even just a billion years. But from a human point of view, even if you terraform a planet like this and it only becomes livable for a billion years, that's more than enough time to live on it. So her research was intended to be good, but as she pointed out herself, this could be perverted into a terrible weapon. So, what, if anything, do we know about Carol Marcus? Carol Marcus, as I said, was a human scientist in the 23rd century, and like some of her predecessors, like say J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was a human theoretical physicist and considered the father of the atomic bomb, the allegory here between the 23rd and 20th century scientists is easy to see. And some even might argue that in the alternative reality, which we'll get to in a bit, she could even be seen as Space Barbie. Oppenheimer, like many, considered the ramifications for what he was creating. The difference was Oppenheimer was trying to create a weapon that could also be used to usher in a new age of science and invention for the human race and take the human species on its baby steps towards what we'll eventually have long distance in the future, take us to the stars themselves. As we know, eventually we get warp capability, and if it wasn't for the work of the pioneers like Oppenheimer, we never would have got there. Marcus was in the same vein. The difference was she wasn't trying to create a weapon in the first place. She did everything she could to try to prevent what she saw as a potentially very destructive and catastrophically weapon of mass destruction from ever being perverted into it, even referring to Starfleet as a military, which shows you somewhat how the civilian, scientific and general greater population of the Federation really did view Starfleet. Despite Starfleet's protestations to the contrary, they were, at least partially, a military organization, and Marcus recognized that. Now, as we know, the Genesis device would be usurped by another group of renegade humans, or evolved humans anyway, Khan Singh and his followers, after they stole the USS Reliance and then would murder many of the scientists on Regular One, steal the Genesis device, which ultimately led to the creation of the Genesis planet when it was detonated inside of a nebula, forcing all the material to coalesce into a very unstable and short-lived planet. So, Marcus, let's get a little backstory on her. Where did she come from? How did she end up at this? Creating a technology, the pioneering science that could literally destroy the existing life matrix of an entire world, billions of years of evolution, blinked out of existence with a single 2-meter-high cylinder? Where did she come from? What we know about her is she had a mother and a father, obviously. Her mother was unnamed, we don't know what she was called, but we do know her father was a Starfleet officer who in at least one reality would become Admiral Marcus. He was, at least again in an alternate reality, a bit of an extremist and a member of Section 31. We don't know much about him from the prime timeline. We can assume that the two men were at least superficially similar. Now, other than that backstory, we know that she encountered a young officer named James T. Kirk, who she was quite enamored with, had a short fling with, she became pregnant. She decided not to tell Kirk about this pregnancy, to protect her child, as she saw it, from Kirk. Now, not that Kirk was abusive or she thought he was to be bad at the job, basically. She knew that Kirk was a career Starfleet officer. She knew it would hurt him to suddenly be encumbered by a child. She knew that the child would never be Kirk's world. Not really. Kirk would always be the Starfleet officer, just like she'd seen with her father. So she decided against involving him in David's life. It wasn't until many, many years later in the events with Khan, the Reliance and Regular One, the Genesis project, that he would even learn he had a son. That is her basic backstory. Now, we'll quickly divert into the alternate reality, the so-called Kelvin timeline. We know in this universe, Dr. Marcus also, we encounter the younger version of her, let's call her Space Barbie, and she also encounters a young, brash officer named James T. Kirk. We don't know for certain that this version of Marcus both had a fling with and would become pregnant by this version of Kirk. We can perhaps make that assertion, but it would be nothing more than an assumption at this moment, as the timelines of these two universes have diverged somewhat considerably from the original timeline. It's possible the changes here were so severe that that never happened and David simply never existed. However, the person is still the same. She's still a brilliant scientist and is on the early stages of what would eventually lead her to the same path, most likely, of developing this device. It also can't be ignored there's certain other parallels here. Both universes, on some level, she had involvement with Khan Noonien Singh. She was involved in some level with, obviously, her father, and having an affair with a young James Tiberius Kirk. And a slightly more left field connection, the Genesis project itself was highly classified by Starfleet, and we know that at this time in Starfleet, or in fact in any time Starfleet, Section 31 was pretty involved in a lot of different aspects. I can't imagine they didn't have their fingers in this pie. As we know, by the early 25th century, at a Section 31 outpost where they hold a lot of their darker technologies, an actual replica of the Genesis device, plus very likely its plans for construction and other materials required for it, was stored here. It's unknown if this Genesis device was built by Section 31, the scientist basically replicating her work, or if it was another prototype, or just simply a later developed version of the one that was used to create the Genesis planet. We simply don't know, but we do know they've got it, and just like in the alternate timeline, she would also have some involvement, at least on some superficial level, with Section 31. Whether or not Marcus was in the prime timeline knowingly or unknowingly working for them, I leave up to your interpretation. She may have been. But again, the obvious parallels with the Manhattan Project here are quite frankly obvious. The whole Genesis project had a lot in common with the Manhattan Project, and Marcus herself had a lot in common with Oppenheimer, with both of them being the parents, respectively, of their own potentially catastrophically powerful technologies that could usher in a new era for humanity and beyond. With both individuals, however, realizing just how dangerous and how potentially destructive their science and their technology could be if ever misused by those that were given the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. We see loosely how the Genesis device could potentially be used to destroy, when we see what it can do when it forces a nebula to make a planet, for God's sakes. We also see in simulations what it can do and destroy whatever life is already there to replace it with a new matrix that it has designed. This could be perverted into a horrible weapon. This is the same thing with nuclear devices, only they've no positive fallout, just radiation and death. But the parallels in the development of the project and how they could potentially be used against sentient life cannot be ignored. And the moral lesson, the moral weight on the shoulders of the respective inventors and heads of these programs must have been immense. And just to throw it in there once again, in the Divergent timeline we see the younger version of Carol Marcus, who of course was still a brilliant scientist, but was also, let's face it, Space Barbie. Again, knockout, gorgeous, Space Barbie. And we got, obviously this picture. We got this. We got this moment. I'm just saying. I'm not saying I don't appreciate the moment. I'm just saying it's there for reasons, I guess. Thanks, J.J. Abrams, I suppose. Good trek you made. And there we have it. As I said, there are obvious parallels, more so to the Manhattan Project here, which was science and technology run amok. It's the question of should we or shouldn't we, and how could it potentially be used, because ultimately there's a point where if you've made something that could be used as a weapon, eventually somebody's going to use it as a weapon, and that thing is still there. The science and knowledge and materials and industry needed to create it are still there, because clearly Section 31 have one, and it's Section 31. The resources of the Federation, they can likely build more of these things. Was this thing developed to fight the Dominion and was just never used, or was it used and we didn't know? Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Will the Genesis device ever be used by the Federation, even by an organization like Section 31? Because once that genie's out of the bottle, it's never going back in. And that is the end of this video, and that is Dr. Carol Marcus, the Star Trek's very own Robert Oppenheimer.